So, good morning, everyone. The title of my talk this morning is The Only Cure for Grief is Grief. And I hope that'll begin to make sense. But grief, as you know, is a universal human experience. It's painful, it's unavoidable, and it's really the flip side of love and attachment and connection. But from a Buddhist perspective, grief is not an enemy to be conquered or a disease to be cured. It's rather seen as a natural part of the human experience that really cries out for our full attention and acceptance. It arises when we lose someone or something dear to us, when the fabric of our lives is torn apart, when there's a void left in us that just seems impossible to fill. It is a very excruciating experience. And in its raw and most unfiltered state, it can be overwhelming. It can be a storm that engulfs us. It just takes over. But within Buddhist teachings and the wisdom that accompanies that, there's a profound truth that the only cure for grief is grief itself. And this paradoxical statement invites us to engage deeply with our own suffering rather than trying to avoid it. And this is a way, somewhat paradoxically again, that offers a path toward healing and transformation. As you know, suffering or dukkha is one of the central tenets of existence, as the Buddha taught, and this arises, of course, from the Four Noble Truths, which tells us that suffering arises from either attachment or aversion, and from clinging to the impermanent as though it were permanent. And that's where grief comes in, because grief in this context is understood as an acute, very real, and very unavoidable manifestation of impermanence and the suffering that it brings. And it emerges when we lose something or someone we were deeply attached to, a loved one, a cherished dream, a sense of identity, our youth and good health. The pain of grief is real, but it is also an invitation to confront the impermanent nature of all things. You know, one of the one of the challenges with the folks in the bereavement group that I facilitate that's often expressed early on is the fear that the worst of their initial acute grief will go on forever. And people will often say, I can't stand this. If this is going to be the rest of my life, they cannot imagine that it would ever soften, even though it will remain, but they can't imagine that it would ever lessen. And so to say that the only cure for grief is grief means that the path to healing doesn't lie in avoidance. It doesn't lie in denial. It doesn't lie in distraction, but in fully embracing and experiencing the sorrow, as hard as that might be. As contrary to our nature as that might be. I mean, when we experience it, we just want it to go away. We just want to get rid of it. But this teaching about the only cure for grief is grief resonates with the Buddhist practice of mindfulness, which encourages us to bring compassionate awareness to our emotions, no matter how painful they may be. And grief may be one of the most painful categories of emotion that we'll ever experience. When we allow ourselves to feel the grief without resistance, we acknowledge the depth of our love. We acknowledge the reality and the magnitude of our loss. And this is consistent with the Buddha's teachings to open fully to all experience, to avoid or run away from none of it, regardless of how painful it might be. By turning toward our grief rather than away from it, we discover that it's not a solid, permanent, unchanging state. Rather, it's a series of moments, thoughts, and sensations that arise and pass away, as does all experience. And in doing this and seeing it that way, we begin to process and integrate this pain into our lives, rather than just letting it fester in the shadows of our minds, just letting it sit there and fester. You know, in modern psychology echoes this wisdom, recognizing that grief is not a problem to be solved, but a process to be lived through. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, many of you know her pioneering work on the stages of grief, emphasized that mourning follows its own timeline and rhythm. And attempts to suppress it, to bypass it, often lead to greater suffering in the long run. Unresolved grief manifests in many ways, including depression, anxiety, physical ailments, what we psychologists call pathological mourning. People get stuck there. They can't move through it, and they suffer a range of problems. True healing requires us to sit with our pain, to honor it as a natural response to loss. And from a Buddhist perspective, this grief is a teacher because it strips away the illusions and attachments and really lays bare for us that the impermanence that underlies all existence. It's a stark and painful reminder of impermanence. When we face our grief with courage and mindfulness, we cultivate the qualities of compassion, patience, and wisdom. It's why we call grief a teacher. We come to see that our suffering is not unique, but shared by all beings, not just human beings, all beings, deepening our connections to others. I'm always amazed. I'm a huge elephant fan, and if you ever watch the herd's response to the death of one of their members, it is grief. It is just plain old-fashioned grief. This is the essence of karuna, or compassionate understanding, which is at the heart of the Buddhist path, this embrace of grief. But by embracing our grief, it doesn't mean wallowing in despair or becoming consumed by it. Remember that the Buddha taught the middle way, avoiding the extremes of denial or avoiding the extremes of indulgence. To fully grieve is to allow the pain to move through us, to express it openly with tears, with words, or maybe with silence, with talking it out with others, to let it soften over time, which it will. And in this process, we learn to hold our grief gently, like a fragile flower, rather than fight it, rather than resist it. We honor it, we respect it, we see the universality of it. And gradually what happens, and I see this again and again in my group, the sharp edges of sorrow begin to fade. And what's left is often this bittersweet tenderness, a reminder of what was lost and a love that endures. And my group members will often talk about honoring the one they lost by the love that does endure. So this notion is that the only cure for grief speaks to the transformative power of acceptance. In Buddhist terms, of course, this is the practice of equanimity, the ability to remain balanced and open-hearted in the face inevitable and painful, often painful, life's ups and downs. When we stop resisting our grief, when we cease wishing for things to be other than they are, that's when we create, and that's how we create, the space for healing to unfold naturally in its own way. And again, acceptance here doesn't mean resignation, nor does it mean indifference. It is an active, courageous choice to face reality as it is. And it is tough, it is hard, and that's why I say courageous. But in the end, grief teaches us about the impermanence and interconnectedness of life. It reminds us that everything we hold dear is fleeting, that every joy carries within it the seed of sorrow. But it also points to the resilience of the human spirit, our capacity to endure pain and find meaning in the midst of loss. It's one of the huge teachers of this human journey. And as we grieve, we honor the depth of our love, the beauty of what was, and the inevitability of change. So in this way, grief becomes not only a source of suffering, which of course it is, but a gateway to wisdom, a gateway to compassion. To understand that the only cure for grief is to embrace the fullness of life with all its beauty and with all its fragility. It is fragile. It is to walk the path of mindfulness, again, courageously facing our pain with an open heart. And ultimately, it is discovered that beneath the waves of all this sorrow lies a still and unshakable peace, the realization that even in the midst of loss, we are not alone. The pain of grief is very real. It is physical, it is emotional, it is psychological. But so is the possibility of healing, a healing that arises not from avoiding it, not from avoiding our grief, but from fully embracing it. So I want to close with one of my favorite parables from the Pali Canon. You've probably heard me teach this before, but it really speaks to this. It's a Buddhist teaching on the nature of grief, a parable of Kisa Gautama, a woman who sought the Buddha's help after losing her only child. Her baby died. And she comes to the Buddha and says, "Great One, I can't bear this grief. You must help me. Please help me." He said, "I can help you." He says, "But here's what you must do first. You must go to every house in the village and ask for a mustard seed from everyone in every house that hasn't experienced death, that hasn't experienced loss. Bring those back to me, and once I have those seeds, then we'll talk about your loss, your grief." And as she did this and found that there was no mustard seeds to be had, it transformed her grief into understanding the universality of loss. And she began to move through her grief and make peace with her loss. It still hurt, but it was a way of seeing the universality of her loss. This story underscores the Buddhist view that engaging with grief, rather than trying to escape it, leads to a deeper wisdom, leads to an acceptance of life's impermanence. So that is the only cure for grief, is grief itself.